But let's go back to your very vivid description of Aleppo, and you've also been to Mariupol. I'm wondering whether you see any parallels between the two cases, both in what the civilians were going through, the military operation, urban warfare, and also media coverage. Because on the surface, it seems like these are two different conflicts. But I think once you start digging deeper, I wonder whether you think there might be some things that are similar, or are they actually different?
No, there's very many parallels. So if we look at the media coverage, for example, like the Western media would say the Syrian quote unquote regime destroyed Aleppo, when in fact, when I was there, and so I went there 3 times on my own and once with a delegation. And the only reason I joined the delegation was because it was bloody expensive to go. It was $100 each way, and I had very little money. And by the way, I didn't stress this before, but nobody was paying for me to go to any of these places, Palestine or Syria, etc. So I was pretty low on money, and there was an option to join a media delegation. I already had permissions, because in Syria you do have to apply for permissions to go to places that are high risk. And I had the permissions at the time that this delegation was going, but I was like, well, if I can get a free ride, why not? And plus I can see what they say about what we all see, right? And so that was really interesting. What was my point with that? My point with that was that yes, it was during that delegation that one of the journalists, so we went to it was supposed to be a humanitarian crossing. So yeah, I'm sure you're aware that in whether it was Aleppo or Eastern Ghouta, Syria and Russia combined tried to open humanitarian crossings in order to allow civilians to flee the area in which Al-Qaeda and other terrorist gangs were, what's the word I was looking for? Not residing. I'm looking for a stronger word.
Operating.
Occupying.
Yeah.
Usually civilians weren't able to flee. There were cases when they could, but usually what happened was that the terrorist groups within would fire upon shelling or machine gun fire on the crossing and make it impossible. So this group of journalists I was with, we were taken to one of these crossings, and it was the same thing. And in fact, we were taken to 2 different crossings. At the first one of the journalists, it might have been Ann Barnard of the New York Times, I don't remember which one, but they basically asked the Syrian, whatever his rank was, general, something like, why don't you just bomb all of there and get rid of them? I think it was a loaded question. I think they were trying to incriminate, but the general replied something to the effect, and I heard this many, many times, we can't, because there are civilians inside there. There are people inside there. Yes, we want to eradicate Al-Qaeda, but our people are there. So we can't just carpet bomb like America did Raqqa. And so that was a theme I'd hear over and over again in Syria. And although I wasn't there from the beginning of fighting in Mariupol, I was there in April. The Azovstal was still ongoing. We were about 1 kilometer away. And the people that we were meeting, they were talking about, and we've heard ample of these testimonies since then. They were speaking about how they were either in the basements or first floor apartments, and Ukrainian forces had taken over upper apartments. So the parallel in this would be both that actually Russia exercised extreme restraint when they were fighting in Mariupol. They didn't flatten Mariupol, as contrary to what the Guardian said. They didn't level Mariupol. There was strategic fighting against areas where Ukrainian forces were occupying, whether it was in schools, whether it was in the upper floor of apartments or Azovstal, etc. But what Western media didn't report, just like they didn't report on the terrorists in eastern Aleppo shelling greater Aleppo and killing like almost 11,000 civilians before Aleppo was liberated, the Western media also didn't report on Ukrainian forces, both holding civilians as human shields effectively when they occupied these upper floors, but also there were many instances in which they fired themselves, the Ukrainian forces, on these buildings. So when I was there in April 2022, I didn't know Mariupol. I hadn't been there before. I didn't know the layout of the city, so I couldn't orient myself until subsequent visits throughout 2022 and then 23 and this past May. But what I saw now when I was back there in May, but also when I was back there in May, I was able to walk around because I was just on my own and I didn't have wheels. So I was walking everywhere in the center of the city. And then I looked back at my footage from 2022, April and onwards, and I was like, okay, now I understand where I was. And it was the key axes of the city. It was Prospect Mira and correct my pronunciation, Metallurgica, or the other main
Metallurgist, probably the street and avenue Metallurgist. Yeah.
No, that one. And they're the ones that meet in the center. And then you would have the drama theater there, the very center of the city, that beautiful church. And so I was with RT. I joined RT in April. I wasn't working with them, but I joined them, and they very kindly said, you can come with us. And so that was my transportation and my translation. And so they were the journalist I was with. He was doing humanitarian runs, taking food to the people who had been stuck in these basements or first floors. And so that's how I was able to see those areas. So when I look back at the footage, I'm like, okay, now I know the city better. I know exactly, maybe not the sub-districts, but I know the street went up. And I look at the footage. Yes, there was destruction here, but these buildings are intact. Yes, look, there's upper floor destruction here. These buildings are intact, And so basically what I'm saying is the buildings that had some destruction or were destroyed, where the Ukrainian forces were. The way the Western media portrayed it was that Russia just went in with a sledgehammer and bombarded everything and destroyed everything. That wasn't the case, because even referring to a Guardian article, I think in 2023, that I only in recent months came across, they're saying the entire center of the city was leveled. And that absolutely wasn't true. I was there, I saw it, and I actually have footage to prove it. So that's a parallel, is that this reporting by omission, as you said before, so omission of what the terrorist in Aleppo did. I sometimes mix the two up now. What the terrorists in Aleppo did, or in Eastern Ghouta, or putting all the blame on the Syrian government or the Russian government, and just removing any blame from these Ukrainian forces and Azov. But there's so many people that were Russian journalists, foreign journalists like Christelle Niant, who was going there repeatedly and taking testimonies. There's so much testimony now of what happened in Mariupol. It's impossible. You have to be lying if you adhere to the Western version of things, that Russia deliberately destroyed the entire city. That wasn't the fact. And in fact, so many testimonies to the contrary, that Russia, just like it has taken its time in other areas, was being very careful in how they were fighting the Ukrainian forces. So I would say those are the main parallels. And also, there's been so much rebuilding in Mariupol since then. Even in September and October, November, when I was going back there, you would already see, like, for example, the main road from Donetsk to Mariupol. I think it was by September, maybe November, that was already repaved. And that was amazing, because the road in April when we went, it was like, I say, when you got back, it felt like you'd been put through a washing machine. It was so bumpy, and you had to go under bridges, etc., to get around just to get there. But by September or November, it was repaved, and there was already cleaning up and rebuilding starting at that time. In November, I think it was, or September, I went to see, the big, massive complex of white apartment buildings, like 3,000 housing units. That was already being built September or October. I forget the date exactly, 2022. And since then, there's been so much rebuilding. And in my last trip there in May, I couldn't tell, I think a lot of what I was seeing was actually just renovation, not rebuilding, because that's a common theme, is that under Ukraine, nothing was being renovated. So I was just walking around, and I intended to go to this one particular spot, maybe a 20-minute walk from the center of the city, where I had read online on a Telegram, there was 3 new apartments. So I was like, okay, I'll go check them out. And as I was walking, I kept stopping because everywhere was being renovated. And I was like, oh, I got to film that. I got to film that. So it's just, this theme that the Western media is still putting out, that Mariupol is occupied, just like they did with Aleppo, and that life hasn't improved. And in fact, when I was back in Aleppo in 2020, 2021 also, no, 2020, it was night and day. Like, there's still a lot of rebuilding, but there was so much life in the streets and around the historic citadel, and it's just like a feeling of a pulse of life that you wouldn't have in both regards when Ukraine and the Ukrainian forces in Azov were there, or in Aleppo and other areas when the Western-backed terrorists were there.
Thank you for that. And I think it's really great that you're giving really specific examples, which I think is one of the reasons that you've been censored, where it's not just a general statement about, Russia good or Syria good, the Syrian government. You're giving very, very specific examples. And of course, a lot of them you've experienced yourself. And regarding Mariupol, I think it's important to mention that some of these testimonials have been translated into English, so they are accessible to a broader audience. And it's specific individuals describing their stories. I remember posting them on Twitter/X many months ago. So, we can bring this up for those who are interested. And I also saw these bird's eye view shots of Mariupol from, I guess it must have been spring, where the church that you mentioned was very much intact. And I was really happy to see that. But now that you put it in context, that it was very particular buildings that were targeted, it makes a lot more sense why a church would be standing, but a building not too far away would be damaged because, as you said, human shields were, the human shield tactic was being employed there.